IS has a capital city, Raqqa in Syria, and an impressive propaganda archive and the capacity to disseminate it to would-be followers around the world. I want to know if that's enough for the so-called Islamic State to live on, or can it be completely defeated? I'm in the briefing room to find out, and to help me are Clint Watts, currently Robert A. Fox Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Programme on the Middle East, and formerly an FBI special agent on a joint terrorism task force. He joins me down the line from New York. Hassan, a senior fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. He's in our Washington studio. And Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, Senior Research Fellow in Arabic at Pembroke College, Oxford. She's in the BBC studio in Oxford. Clint Watts, first, will the so-called Islamic State, do you think, lose its caliphate?
I think there is a mistake in the dichotomous relationship in which we talk about the Islamic State. There's only two narratives that are really put forth oftentimes in the media. Either the Islamic State is this dominant caliphate that's going to take over the world, or they're on defeat and they'll just evaporate into thin air. And I think there is a middle ground there that is much more reasonable. I think what we should more reasonably expect is, one, there will be some sort of Sunni extremist group in eastern Syria and western Iraq for as long as at least I'm alive. That's unlikely to be rooted out. But I think you'll also start to see Iraqi Sunnis, for example, start to defect. These are Ba'athist and former Iraqi army members. They'll start to fracture and break away, likely after the fall of Mosul and as the international forces sort of advance on Raqqa. And there will always be some sort of conflict there because there's no long-term plan to resolve the Syrian conflict, and there's no real stability options, I don't think, for governance over the long term. So I think it's not necessarily one or the other. I think it's an enduring conflict where it'll either be improving or deteriorating depending on the time frame you're looking at.
Elisabeth Kendall, you've said that the existence of the idea of territory is a very important part of IS's appeal. So would you generally agree that in its loss of territory, it loses the thing that is truly unique about it?
I think in losing territory, it does lose a great deal of credibility. It's hugely undermining because the idea of a caliphate has been so central to Islamic State's propaganda and to its appeal. It completely shatters the illusion of a functioning Islamic utopia where you can bring up your children in a pure and safe environment away from the pressures of globalization. Why would you uproot your family in the West to go and move to a war zone?
How are they managing to sell their loss of territory?
Well, the loss of territory can certainly be explained away using the Prophet Muhammad himself as a precedent, who encountered various setbacks. But it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like God's on your side when you're losing in battle. And one very interesting aspect of this that we saw last year was that the main Islamic State magazine, Derbic, actually refers to, in the title, to a town in northern Syria, which is supposed to be the site for the end-of-time battle. Now, as they started losing territory, this was going to be a bit awkward. So they actually switched the title of their magazine to Rumia, which means Rome, and is a far more generic clash of civilizations. It's not too specific because, of course, having lost Derbic finally in October last year, that wouldn't have looked good.
So they didn't make the mistake of naming their magazine after yet another place they were likely to lose.
They named it Rome, which basically symbolised Byzantium and the sort of clash between Muslim and Christian empires, a much more general framing of their project.
One of the great lessons of salesmanship, keep it vague. Hassan, going back, since we're discussing the territory point at the moment and how kind of central it is to their existence, what Elisabeth Kendall said reminds us that there's, in a sense, a kind of difference between what Islamic State is on the ground and the appeal of it to people outside the Islamic State.
I agree to a large degree that the territory is very important for the Islamic State. However, I think today we see a disconnect between how ISIS is doing on the ground in terms of controlling territory or having a viable caliphate and its appeal outside. I think there is a separation today between these two things. I think that's a big loss. That's a missed opportunity by the international community to hit ISIS hard and hit it right in the beginning in the way they deal with politics as well as the military challenge.
Let's think about that in the context of the withdrawal or the defeat of ISIS in the territory that they've held, Elisabeth Kendall, because this is something that really intrigues me. You've got people here in Mosul, for instance, and Raqqa the same, who've lived for over 2 years under ISIS rule, who've gone to schools insofar as they exist under ISIS rule, who've tried to make their lives work under ISIS rule. What do you think, once that area is, if we use the word liberated from so-called Islamic State, is going to be the situation of that population psychologically and physically?
Oh, that's absolutely a key question, because I think the success and ability to hold down a so-called defeat of Islamic State will rely almost entirely on what we then put in its place, how we deal with the traumatized populations. Normally we're pretty good at destroying things, and we're less good at working out what is then going to go in their place.
Well, let's talk about that specifically, because the first question, I suppose, about that is who is actually going to go into these places and who is going to hold them and who is going to do the building. Clint Watts, I know that you have some quite strong opinions about this.
Right. It is the plaguing factor over the last 2.5 years of what I've affectionately called the let 'em rot strategy, which is the sort of boxing in of the Islamic State, slowly eroding them with airstrikes and marching in a series of proxy forces and army forces, Iraqi army forces, to slowly make gains against them. And in that sense, it has kept U.S. forces mostly off the battlefield. But they cannot be removed or defeated in the way we characterize it, especially here in the West, without some sort of occupying force which can clear, hold, and build and return governance in some form. There is no one that can go in, no force that can go in and take Raqqa and hold it. And so at some level, at some point, we will have to, as the international coalition starts to march on Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State, decide who we will deal with and who we will barter with to govern that area over the longer term. And I don't think any member of the coalition, particularly the United States, has thought that through.
Okay, can I just ask you a very quick question about that? Because one of the things that's changed in the last few months has been the election of Donald Trump. And this has increased, if you like, a kind of rhetorical suggestion that something's going to happen for once and for all. Clint, do you actually think anything different, really significantly different, is going to happen as a result of that rhetoric? Or is essentially the approach going to be a continuation of the one started by Barack Obama?
By, I think, almost anyone's assessment of it, there's only one step tougher than President Obama, which was to deploy, up to 100,000 U.S. troops to clear, hold, build, try and do counterinsurgency, much like the U.S. military did in Iraq 10 years ago. And at this point, it doesn't look like the political will is there, short of a major terrorist attack against the United States. That might be the one thing that would bring that action forward.
Elisabeth Kendall, can we talk a bit about so-called Islamic State's appeal in other countries in the region? I mean, you've done a lot of travelling in Yemen, you know a lot about Libya and other places. What do you think will happen there?
Well, I think this is definitely something to watch. When you squeeze a group or a collection of groups like Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, you might well find that they start to crop up elsewhere. And I think with so many failed or failing states around the Middle East, Somalia, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, the resurgence of Islamic State outside Syria and Iraq in places where it already has smaller cells remains a real possibility. And I think Yemen would be top of my list. It has all the ingredients for a safe haven for Islamic State fighters to regroup. It's a failed state, it's a war zone, it has a famine, it has a rampant smuggling apparatus and a vast and porous coastline, so it's accessible. And most of all, the war has fueled sectarian tensions, the Sunni Shiite tensions, that militant jihad feeds on. So really, it's an ideal battlefront. Now, although al-Qaeda is currently much stronger in Yemen, if they manage to get together and focus on their common perceived Shiite enemy, then they could well get along.
Now, forgive me for asking what seems like a very naive question, but a lot of people thought that once old bin Laden was taken out in Pakistan in 2011, that was the end of al-Qaeda. So what is al-Qaeda now?
Al-Qaeda has been playing a much longer game than Islamic State. And I think one of the things we never quite seem to appreciate is that we can take out as many leaders as we like, but someone always comes up to replace them. The thing about al-Qaeda is that it's very difficult to define. It manages to root in with tribes. It gets under the skin of a society, and its culturally attuned narratives, I would say, although they're much rawer and much cruder than is what Islamic State produces, somehow they do chime with local populations. It's very localized.
But if you don't mind, again, it's not a naive question, but again, who's running it? I mean, is there someone, or should we completely lose the notion that this is somehow run like so-called Islamic State is, has a series of offices, as Charlie Winter pointed out, in various places? Al-Qaeda has no such sort of centrality. It's much more diffuse.
Well, of course, Ayman al-Zawahiri is the nominal, well, not just the nominal, he is the de facto leader of al-Qaeda globally, and generally considered to be hanging out somewhere in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, although I don't know that for sure. I think they're still alive and kicking.
So to ask this, again, I suppose ask the relatively obvious question. So-called Islamic State had an objective, which was to have an Islamic State. What is al-Qaeda trying to do?
Al-Qaeda also wants an Islamic State. It's simply that it says that it won't announce it until populations are ready for it. People need to be re-educated in Islamic principles, and there needs to be a general consensus for it. Your question actually, or your statement, is key, because what could happen now is that al-Qaeda could be considered to have more credibility because it didn't rush into announcing an Islamic State that it can't hold. It's always argued that Islamic State's announcement of a caliphate was premature and criticised its brutality. We could now see it benefiting from that.
Oh, I see. So al-Qaeda can turn around and say, look, those fools in the so-called Islamic State, they went off at half-cock, they've messed up and so on, they tried to do things too quickly, and they were far too brutal and nasty to the local population, and we're your kind of slower burn, more kind of touchy-feely jihadis.
That is exactly right. And we're seeing messages not quite as blunt as that, but similar in spirit to what you've just said, coming out now all over the telegram wires.
By the way, if you're listening, al-Qaeda, don't say you got the idea from me. Will attacking the West, in the West, still be an important part of jihadi strategy? I mean, it sounds like a selfish question given the agonies that people in the region have undergone, but nevertheless, I think listeners would want to know. Don't Watts?
Dave, I think we're at a period where it can go in two directions. If you had asked me last September or October, I would have said that jihadis will learn and they'll make a smarter decision, and they will say, look, the caliphate is a winning proposition, and it mobilizes our supporters in ways that even al-Qaeda could not mobilize them. But if anything they learned from both al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is that constantly provoking the West and a global enemy brings intense counterterrorism pressure. And so I think there is a strain of localists that have learned this approach and now see places like Yemen or far-flung battlefields maybe in Central Asia as a place where they can test the caliphate model without provoking the West. At the same point, with the election of President Trump and the shift in rhetoric from Western governments, globalists, again, have a new opportunity. And when I say globalists, I'm talking about those in al-Qaeda, the senior leadership, those senior leaders in the Islamic State that are still trying to survive and thrive, picking out global targets to bring back recognition and provoke an attack. The U.S. has not been more ripe since 9/11 to overreach than it is right now. And a pinprick strike by al-Qaeda or the Islamic State would bring a massive response, I think, from the United States. And that massive response would provide an opportunity for al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to unify essentially Muslims under their banner in a sort of battle for the end times, an apocalyptic battle. I don't know the answer to it, but I think it could go either direction.
Well, for me at least, you've created a whole new conceptual language to kind of think about the so-called Islamic State in, which is the battle there between, or the struggle between the globalists who will come and hit us, or the localists who are going to try and make us sort of stay away. Elisabeth, Kendall, we've talked about some of the big dangers. I suppose we ought to think a little bit about what could be done to try and make sure that you don't have a recrudescence of jihadism in those areas of Iraq and likewise in Yemen and other places.
Well, I think we need to have a far better understanding of how matters work locally, at a very local level, on the ground. Lots of analysts and scholars claim to understand what motivates a jihadist. What is it that makes a militant jihadist? But of course, this varies enormously from place to place and from time to time. And even with the best will in the world and the biggest data set, you can't nail it down to the perfect set of ingredients. We have to be going in at a local level and working out how it's driven.
Hassan, what's your, you don't have an instant solution, but a general strategic approach to try and dampen down the jihadi possible revival after its so-called Islamic State?
I don't mean to be grim, but I think this war against jihadism, as it stands, is unwinnable, in the sense that the United States and other countries who are most capable of fighting these groups don't have the bandwidth to engage in a generational war against these organizations, a war that focuses on the local factors that led to the rise of these organizations in the first place. Over the past 2 years and a half in Iraq and Syria, what we've seen is that ISIS has been treated as the problem, and they were fighting ISIS as if it's the only problem that Iraq and Syria have had. The problem, though, ISIS in Syria is a symptom of a bigger problem. There's a conflict, there's violence, there is savagery committed by all sides. And only an end in that bloodbath that's going on in Syria and reforming the political order in Iraq and establishing some sort of local support for that counterterrorism strategy, that war is going to continue. These organizations, whether Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Ahrar al-Sham, all these jihadists, will learn from each other, will evolve, and we will see more groups emerging if these organizations disappear.
Clint Watts, can you hold out any more hope than that?
I generally agree that there is no victory or loss in terms of the battle against terrorism and jihadism broadly. There's just degrees of winning or losing. There will never be the complete vanquishing of terrorists globally, and at the same point, you'll never see them rise up to such a level that the West collapses, which is sometimes a narrative that you hear as well. What tends to happen is it becomes a mitigation strategy, and I think that's been the more appropriate approach over the past 4 to 5 years with regards to Syria, which is how do you deal with all these different conflicts and tamp them down to a certain degree. And ultimately it'll be a question about, as the U.S. has sort of withdrawn almost from the Middle East over the last several years, is will this get redirected to someone else? If you look back to the original Mujahideen, they were fighting a different foreign enemy, which was the Soviet Union then at the time. And, why wouldn't jihad maybe shift its target, especially from the perspective of the globalists, to a different regime or a different country that it wants to battle? So I think that's equally likely. What we'll ultimately end up having is Americans don't want to deploy, at least in the U.S. case, and probably the West as well, they don't want to deploy hundreds of thousands of soldiers for extended periods to try and restore governance to places they generally don't care about, that don't really have the underlying conditions to ever function in a democratic capacity anyways. And so with that left, you'll really see, and I think this is the turn of the Trump administration, a reverting back to using proxies, using local regimes to try and hold down or tamp down the terrorism. And even when they do that, it will ultimately give rise to another attack, either today, tomorrow, or someday in the future.
Well, on that uncheerful note, we have to end it for this week. I'd like to thank my guests, consultant Columb Strack, Charlie Winter from King's College London, Elisabeth Kendall from Oxford University, former FBI agent Clint Watts, and Washington-based researcher and author Hassan. My producer for this episode was China Collins, and research was by Serena Tarling. If you'd like to listen to the programme on Radio 4, we're on Thursdays at 8 o'clock in the evening UK time. If you're looking for other quality podcasts to listen to, subscribe to a new series called Intrigue, Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel. It's the story of a mysterious death that changed the course of Chinese politics, and it's based on an investigation by the BBC's China correspondent Carrie Gracie. Just search for Murder in the Lucky Holiday Hotel BBC. And if you'd like to let us know what you think about the series, there's an easy way to do it. Just write a review or rating on iTunes or your podcast provider. We look forward to reading your comments.